So our next speaker is Dr. Dan Devlin, and he's a professor of agronomy and currently serves as the director of the Kansas Center for Agricultural Resource and Environment, and is their director of their Kansas Water Resources Institute, which is analogous to our Iowa Water Center. And Dan's going to be talking to us today about are the Great Plains going dry? You're going to answer the question.
Well, thank you. It's good to be here in Iowa at the Iowa Water Conference. And for several years, I see Rick Cruz around, and I say, Rick, I really want to come to your water conference because we do a water conference in Kansas in November. And I said, Rick, I'd like to go to yours, and I always see it late after it's over or the day that it started. So this year, Rick invited me clear back in November and said, Rick, Dan, why don't you come up, but you've got to give a talk if you come. So that's, so that's why, and this is my topic, and yesterday I was here at the conference and I went to a number of the presentations and looked over the agenda, and it was really interesting, really good day yesterday. And somebody called me about 5 o'clock, one of the faculty, about something. And he said, tell me about the water conference. And I said, well, it seems like the elephant at the conference is the nutrient reduction strategies and tile drainage and nitrogen. Is that right? That seems to be the kind of, if you take that off the table, I don't know what we talk about here at this conference, because it seems to be the real elephant in the room in water quality. In Kansas, if you went to my conference in November or our conference this November, the issues, we're going to talk about water quality because we have the same issues you do. We have nutrients, particularly in eastern Kansas. We don't have nitrogen because we don't have tile drainage. We have phosphorus, serious phosphorus problems. We've got livestock waste issues. We've got soil erosion, sedimentation, all the same issues that you have. But the big issue that you would see at our conference is going to be drought. That's big. We've been in a drought for 15 years in western Kansas and the southern Great Plains. I don't know, we get a little rain once in a while, and we're out of it for a little bit, but we're back into it. I'd say we're back into it again. And the other big issue that we've been dealing with for 30 years, I should say we've been talking about for 30 years, and that's aquifer depletion. And we're going to talk about this issue. I'm going to chat a little bit about really where are we at, where's it going, and then I want to spend the rest of the time talking about our groundwater decline and the impact that's having today, and the major impact it's going to have on rural communities, our farming, our livestock industry, and really even the state economy. So I'm going to talk about that. I wish we had tile drainage problems. That's what I wish we had. Because it looks like we can kick that one down the road if you have to, and without any major consequences. So I want to talk about some of those. And if we look at the Great Plains.
Check your mic for me, but is it on?
What was it? Is it on? I may have shut it off. Can you hear me better now?
Yeah.
Okay.
There we go.
Great. And so if we look at the Great Plains, and I thought I'd throw a picture up of what we consider to be the Great Plains, really everything west of here, between really the Missouri River and the Rocky Mountains is what we think about as the Great Plains. We consider it to be the Great Plains. All the way down into Texas. I'm going to focus a little bit more on this region. And this is what I think about, what I do a lot of work in with colleagues in Oklahoma and Texas and Colorado and Kansas. And that's really the southern Great Plains. Really the large, if you look at the livestock feeding industry, something like 30% of the fed cattle comes out of this region. The 25% of the ag production comes out of this region. Overall ag production comes out of this region. It's really a lot of dryland agriculture, a lot of irrigated. There's about 10 million acres of irrigated agriculture that comes out of this region. Really big region. I'm going to focus on this one and also a little bit, probably quite a bit on Kansas, what I know about. Now, if we look at the region in general, Kansas and the Great Plains, you can see if we look at precipitation, you look at Iowa there, it looks like you guys are pretty stable across the entire state. As you get out of the Great Plains, as we get higher in elevation, closer to the Rockies, we've got precipitation in this circle here all the way from about 10 or 12 inches up to about 24. If you go to Kansas, you see tremendous precipitation variations go across the state. And so as you go, each county, as you go from east to west, we lose about 1.5 inches of rainfall, annual precipitation. So if we get down in southeast Kansas, down around Pittsburgh, we'll be up around 50 inches on the average. So really what we think about is as a climate of really high precipitation, rainfall, runoff. And as we go west, as we get out to western Kansas, out of Tribune, Ulysses, out in that area, about 2/3 of the way out, I always, when I drive to Garden City to go to the experiment station, about 2/3 of the way I get west to Larned, and all at once I look around, there's not any trees anymore. And so you really know you're almost to the end of the world, I think, sometimes. You see no trees then, but you get on that western edge out there, and we'll get down to maybe a 14-inch annual precipitation. We went through the drought at our Tribune experiment station in 2011, 2012, 2013, and we had a total of 8.2 inches over the 3 years. So tremendous drought. When we have droughts, it's tremendous drought that can last for several years. So we've got a lot of dry weather. If we look at ET, and I know I was at a talk yesterday about evapotranspiration. Everybody knows what that is, right? Evaporation, transpiration, we use it for irrigation scheduling. You know, in fact, we used to every day on the radio, we would come out and we would announce what the previous day's water use was, corn water use. We still have that. So we deal with irrigation scheduling by ET. I feel like this one may be hard to see up in the northeast corner, which we'd consider to be more of our corn belt soils. Historically a lot of dryland corn up in that area. And we have a reference ET there annuals about 42 inches. And then as you range to western Kansas, the one there at southeast, that'd be at Garden City, we're right at 80 inches of annual precipitation. Or I should say ET. As you go down towards Lubbock into Texas, we'll get some areas down there that will be as high as 90 inches of ET, annual water use, ET, reference ET. So we're going from an area of very low rainfall in western Kansas. At the same time, we've got very high water demand, low humidity, high temperatures, low rainfall, which gives us a real advantage in cattle feeding. You know, we have cool nights, no mud. What do feedlots like? They like no mud. And so we have a real advantage in the cattle feeding industry, and that's why it's really migrated to that region, and we have a real advantage there over Iowa. Now, if we look at the water demand, and then we look at what's really happened, and this would be some data from the High Plains Regional Climate Center over at Lincoln, Nebraska, and I had some charts of our different regions. I couldn't find my slides that showed the long-term trends at different regions in Kansas, but this is one that summarizes the long-term trends in Kansas and then the northern part of the Great Plains, the changes that have already occurred in this graph. For example, in Kansas, over the last 100 years or so, our trend has been that our average temperature is about 1.1 inches higher, or 1.1 degrees higher has been the trend. With rainfall, we could say maybe a little higher, but not really a lot of difference in precipitation. We are seeing, I think, a change in timing of precipitation. We're getting less fall rainfall. Wheat's becoming less predictable, and we've seen in Kansas a big drop in wheat acres. We were at 13 million acres planted in 1990. This fall, we're right around 8.8 million acres. So we've seen a change in cropping due to some of this. If we look at the future, and of course, if you look at the 1.1 degree, which isn't a big difference, but when you look at ET and water demand, much of that's wrapped around humidity and temperature. Higher temperatures increase ET and water demand. So if you look at the future, most of the models that I think we see everything. You know, there's wild models out here, but most of the models would say for the central and southern Great Plains that we're expecting temperature increases of about 1 to 4 degrees Fahrenheit Already we've seen our last freeze in the winter is about, we're predicting about 2 to 3 days earlier now than it was 40 years ago. And our first freeze in the fall is about 2 to 40 days later also. So again, we're increasing ET and water demands. I heard yesterday several discussions that talked about extreme events in Iowa. Your predictions for climate change in Iowa is what? More flooding events, maybe more drought. And that's the same thing we're expecting. We're not concerned so much about flooding, but we are concerned about more drought and lasting longer is our real concern as we look at that. Now, if we move to what's really happened out there so far in western Kansas, and when I say western Kansas, we could throw a map of Colorado, eastern Colorado, panhandle of Oklahoma, Texas in there. This is one that we don't talk about in Kansas, but I think it's pretty significant as you look at it. And I know it's a little hard to see, this isn't the best map. But this shows major perennial stream changes in western Kansas from 1961, when we were really just getting started in irrigation in the late 50s or early 60s, and the changes from 1961 to 2009. So prior to that time, all the blue would be perennial streams. Red there would be streams that were perennial prior to 1961, and they are not perennial streams any longer. So if you see, for example, the Arkansas River or the Arkansas River comes out of Colorado, fed by the mountains, snowfall in Colorado. And at one time, it was our second largest river in the state. In fact, we only have 2 navigable rivers by law in the state. One of those is the Kansas River, which goes through Kansas City, goes to the Missouri, and then the Arkansas River. And we have photos clear back in the 1880s. During the cattle drive days, they would bring paddle boats, ships, all the way up to Dodge City at that time. Today, since about 1970s, it went dry west of Holcomb, Kansas, which is clear out here. We have a large surface water irrigation system out there that funnels the water there. So we go dry west of Holcomb, and we're dry all the way almost to Great Bend in central Kansas. In that particular, again, one of our largest rivers historically in the state. Once in a while we'll have water in it, but there's no water today in it. And so maybe once every 5 years we'll get some water that'll go in that river. And it's really occurred for a couple of reasons. One is we pumped the groundwater. So, and particularly the alluvial aquifers that provided the base flow for most of the year for the river. So we pumped that down low enough where there's no interaction between the groundwater and the surface water any longer. So that's one of the other one is we've done a great job with irrigation. In 1970, we were using mostly irrigation systems, flood irrigation, and we were about 50% efficient. So you got to a lot of fields, and to get the water through the fields, we'd have a lot of return flows. So if we'd pump 1 million acre feet, we would have a part of that water, a substantial part of that water would come back as return flows and go back into the river and provide us some flow in the river. And then the third reason is because of farming practices. In the prior to freedom to farm, like in the mid-1990s, a lot of the dry land area, they were in a fallow wheat system. So we grow a crop every other year under that system. And that was a highly inefficient system, so we get a fair amount of runoff and subsurface flow in wet years. Today, everybody in dryland that's in dryland non-irrigated or no-till. We're trying to save that water, and so in many cases we're trying to grow a crop 2 years out of 3, or even 3 years out of 3. So we brought corn, soybean, in some cases soybeans and sorghum in the rotations where they historically weren't there. So one thing I would say on the positive side of this map is that I also run our watershed programs, and we have a lot of TMDLs, watershed plans, and from about here west, we don't have a need for any watershed programs because we don't have any surface water out there. So that's pretty it's when you think about aquatic ecosystems and you know what you start thinking about, we're beyond that stage there. So in surface water, we'd have to say we're going dry in surface water. And if you look at groundwater, which is really the major economic driver for agriculture in Kansas. And I'll show some of that data later. This again, I apologize, not the greatest slide. This would show the High Plains Aquifer, what we call the Ogallala. It's the largest aquifer in North America. It's the first or largest aquifer in the world as far as water that's used there. Nebraska, they irrigate something like, 7 million acres of corn off the Ogallala. It's less, and as we go south, you see, well, the blue there, this one would show what was there in 1970, the saturated thickness, or 1990. And it's a little hard to see, and if you get up in the Nebraska there, they have saturated thickness there. In some cases, they're 800 to 1,000 feet. Saturated thickness would mean how much water do you have there. It's a sand and gravel layer. It's basically how deep is the water and how much is there. The greater the saturated thickness, the more water you have, and the better it is. The longer it takes to pump. As you go south, this water, as you get into Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, Colorado, we had less water. Most of our area, we had saturated thickness of 50 to 300 feet of saturated thickness. So when you start thinking about groundwater depletion, it's all about how much did you have and do you have recharge, and then how much do you use. So as we look at it, and then we go to the next slide here, and I'm going to show, maybe I added some slides, but we look then at groundwater declines, and these are showing the water level changes from 1980 to 1999. And I'll show you some in Kansas, some year-to-year changes here in a little bit. But we've had areas in southwest Kansas, Panhandle of Oklahoma, down in the Lubbock and Amarillo areas, where we've had greater than 150 feet of decline. In areas where we had 300 feet maximum during that time. Southwest Kansas, we look at the next slide. Let's see. This is one that, if I can get it to work here. Okay, this is one we'll go through this again, but this would be accumulated water level change, groundwater change. How far below the surface, how much from 1996 through 2012. And show you year by year. And this is Kansas, western Kansas, the border there, north to south. And you can see in areas there that we had water changes there over that 15 years of greater than 70 feet of water decline over a 15-year period. Some of the areas don't look quite as bad. Groundwater management number 1 is out here. It doesn't look as bad, and it's mainly because that water is almost completely used up. So there's very little water left there. We're still irrigating. If you look at the next slide, this would be one that's at one time we indicated that once saturated thickness got below 30 feet of saturated thickness, there would not be well capacity enough to irrigate any longer. And so this is what that would show, the estimated usable lifetime for the Ogallala Aquifer in Kansas using the previous 15 years of average water use. So for example, and we were wrong, of course, when we did this. And this isn't useful any longer because farmers are pretty innovative and new technologies have helped them. For example, in this one, which is groundwater management number 1, most of that region, of that irrigation region, is below the 30 feet of saturated thickness. But what they're doing is they're pumping longer. So where at one time they might have 1,000 gallons per minute well, now they're at 150 gallons per minute well, but they've dug more wells. So they may be running 3 wells, putting them together, and then the other thing that we can do is we irrigate then year-round. So they're irrigating today because we can't get enough well capacity to raise corn, full season corn, during the irrigation season. So one way around that is to irrigate longer. So we've got some irrigation systems that are running over 300 days a year. try to fill the profile up to get ready for the irrigation system. Some of the other areas, southwest Kansas, we've got more water. So there we may be in hundreds of years there at current use before we actually get to the point we don't have any water left. So you can see it's a crisis situation in western Kansas. We've got some estimations here of where we are. We did this work, published this in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in, I guess, last year. And estimating what will happen. This did not take in climate change. So climate change, we know, will decrease recharge, which is, recharge is almost zero as you get to the western third of Kansas and down in Oklahoma and Texas. There's no recharge. But for example, we started irrigating, most of the irrigation development started occurring in the 1950s. We had a tremendous drought in the 30s. We had another drought in the 50s, early 50s that was worse than the 30s. And so most of the irrigation development really occurred in the 1950s through the 1960s. And then we closed, in the 70s, then we closed off any new irrigation rights. So if you look at by pre-development there in northwest Kansas, west central, southwest, the storage there, pre-development, by 1960, we were just really getting into irrigation at that time. And so we had almost over 90% of the water still left. By 2010, depending on where we had used up 61% of the water in west central Kansas. They just had less water available there. And we would predict by 2060, and that's using what we think is current use rates, what was used the last 10 years, we'll have across western Kansas, we'll be down to about 30% of pre-development water use. And we don't take in, as saturated thickness drops, well capacities also drop. So it's a little bit like soil erosion. As you lose your soil, you lose your productivity. It's the same way with irrigation. So it's, and then we'd say by 2010, basically at 2110, irrigation, probably somewhere around 2060, irrigation would really drop out. We'd become mostly dryland again. So I guess we'd have to say, when you look at that, it's fairly dire. Would you agree with me, we're probably going dry again? Probably going to go to dryland again. It's going to get drier, and particularly with the climate changes that are predicted out there. And in the last 3 years, the governor called this the most critical issue in Kansas. And so for the last 3 years, we've been developing a vision for 2050 in Kansas. So we've got lots of vision. But I'd say we haven't had a lot of action. And it's very difficult. It's very easy to know what the solution is if we want to sustain the aquifer, and that is reduce pumping rates. Get rid of pumping. Pump less water. That's really the solution to it. And I'd say your nitrogen problem in surface water looks fairly easy being in Kansas. You know, quit planting so much corn, apply less nitrogen. Is that right, Rick? When you get to Topeka, though, and you get to Kansas, it gets much more difficult when you start talking about property rights, difference in philosophy stewardship. We've got some that say it's just like oil is, we ought to pump it till we use it. It's not any good if we don't use it. We have a whole other group that says we ought to give the next generation and the generation after the same opportunity to prosper in western Kansas as we've had. There's all kinds of different options, but we haven't come to the solution yet. Have a few more minutes?
Yes, you do.
Well, I will talk a little more about the aquifer then and take some questions. In our aquifer in Kansas, it's really the High Plains aquifer. And we really have we separated into three hydrologically connected aquifers, even though it's all the High Plains. We've got the Equus beds, which serves the Wichita area. It's a very high water table. It's within 20 feet of the surface. It's in a 35-inch rainfall area. That one is almost sustainable. We have, in wet years, we have a lot of recharge in that aquifer. As we move west to the Great Bend Prairie, which is around Pratt, it's a very sandy soils. It was developed later. The irrigation was developed later there because it's more rolling ground. And so it wasn't developed until center pivot irrigation became available. So it was developed mostly in the 1970s, and by that time we knew that the western, the Ogallala region, had been over-appropriated because it's fairly flat, so they could surface irrigate it prior to center pivots. So they did not over-appropriate, plus it's in a little higher rainfall area, so we get more recharge. So we're about, I think our last, we consider we're about 5% from being sustainable there. So they're working to, one of the things they want to do is remove end guns on center pivots that are very inefficient. So lots of evaporation. So they're about, we think they're about 5% off of being sustainable there. As we go west then, as we get into that low rainfall area, that's the most critical agricultural for us in Kansas. And that watershed, we consider we get about 1/10 of an inch of recharge a year. As you get closer to the state line with Colorado, it's basically no recharge. And so we estimate we'd have to reduce irrigation about 90% to get to sustainable levels. And that basically takes out irrigation. And there's all kinds of reasons out there. Some of the things that, and we already talked about some of these, and some of the reasons it's difficult to deal with, one is it's very heterogeneous. So even within a county, there's areas where we've got a lot of saturated thickness, we've got 100 years of water, and we also have other areas where we're already out of water. So it's very heterogeneous. And so it's hard to say, let's reduce everybody's water allocation by 20%, because everybody's different. It's recharge is minimal. We know it's a big problem. One of the other problems we have is it's a common pool resource. And I don't know of another ag resource that may be a common pool. In other words, you think about it, you're in a community, in an area, if you reduce your irrigation, if you reduce and your neighbor doesn't, he uses that water because it does move around. And so to make it work, it's almost either has to be everybody has to volunteer to do the same thing, or we have to do some regulatory action that we go across the entire area because it's a common pool resource. It's different than soil erosion because it's not a common pool research. We've got some farmers that have already stopped irrigating. I would say most areas have experienced significant declines in well capacity. My family irrigates in western Kansas. A few years ago, they started having problems. They turned the irrigation wells on, and they go about 10 days, and all at once, their well capacities go way down. And so they're at maybe half the capacity. And so that's the kind of declines that they've seen and why they've managed out of that side. This is kind of development of irrigation. Each one of those would be an irrigation permit. And you can see how it's kind of moved over the years, where really by about 1980, we had stopped all irrigation rights, new rights in western Kansas. So today we have 45,000 water rights. Each one has an allocation, and it started out as a proven allocation, and they're still on that. Very few of them can get to their allocation. And you can see, I think just like Iowa, we're seeing a lot more irrigation now in eastern Kansas. With the high commodity prices, people were looking at ways they could stabilize their yields. So the same thing. If we look at the importance of that, and this was for a different talk, but we look at these 8 counties in southwest Kansas. These 8 counties that are all over the water, have the best water, they are responsible for 35% of our agricultural output in the state. It's big cattle country, it's big corn country, and so it's all around water. Although the whole state has ag, the water is where the big ag is. One of the other things that's happened, your corn breeders have done a tremendous job here in Iowa in that we're planting corn now. The least water efficient crop. If you look through the years, it's even greater now. We're up around 2.2 million acres of irrigated corn now. And you can see back in the 80s, we were down as low one year like 600,000 acres of corn. We were growing wheat at that time, some irrigated wheat. We were growing grain sorghum. We went to corn. Corn is where the money is. Many irrigators have said, I'm going to irrigate and I'm going to grow corn until I can't water any longer. There's too much money in corn. So that's where they are. And I'll just, I think I'm about out of time here. And this is kind of our cattle on feed. It all goes together. Irrigation, corn production. Our feedlots they want to feed corn. They used to feed wheat, they used to feed sorghum, they want to feed corn. And thank you for shipping some of your corn west. But we have right now, Garden City, Kansas has the highest corn price in the country right now, is in western Kansas with feedlots. You can see there, cattle on feed has really followed the irrigation that's out there. Just to give you, well, I was going to show another one. I think the option here, just to finish up maybe with some questions, I think one of the options is I think we're going to use it until it's gone. I think we're going to try to do things, but it's a property right in state law, and it's going to be hard to take that water away for lots and lots of different reasons. I think there's going to be an attempt, and we've got some local areas where they're trying to reduce the withdrawal rates. We're going to keep increasing irrigation efficiency, but irrigation efficiency is not going to take care of the problem because, unfortunately, every drop of water has a value. So if we increase the irrigation efficiency, those farmers are going to use it somewhere else because every drop has a significant value. And there's been some questions about going to sustainable yield, and I don't think that's going to happen either, just because that would devastate the economy of those local communities. So I'll stop there. Have time for a question?
Sure, we have time for
any questions? I'm out of Kansas, so I can say pretty much what I want today. Yes.
Presumably there's some municipal systems out there using this. Where do they stand?
It's a good question. The question was, there's some municipal cities that use it. First, we don't have a lot of cities out there. Our largest town in West would be Garden City. It's about 25,000. But it is a concern. And what we thought originally would happen would be it would get too expensive for irrigation. And there would always be enough water there for the cities and towns. Because the biggest problem with irrigation, it gets so deep and so expensive to pump. And so that is a concern. They have water rights, though, and they're maintaining those water rights, and they buy more water rights as we go along. Where we had some real problems at is rural residents, farm families that their well goes dry, and they've got to move because they don't have water, domestic water. So for the urban use, there's not a lot of urban, and they've got their rights secured. Yes.
I remember reading some studies, I just want to make sure I remember the story right. The water in the Ogallala pretty much recharged under a cooler, wetter climate regime. I mean, in other words, under today's climate, we're really not, as you said, we're really not putting any water into that aquifer. That all happened under a different climate scheme. Is that correct?
Well, as far as I understand it, the water we're using, particularly in the western, in the drier areas, it's been there for millions of years. And it was actually when the Rocky Mountains came up, it's when that water was really developed. And there was a freshwater reservoir there in the sea, and it came up through there. And so I don't know, it may have been wetter at one time. And it was, of course, for that. But, I'm not going to give you a good answer on that one. Sorry. Yes?
Is there a usable, deeper aquifer that's feasible for people to be using, and are they doing that?
Yeah, the question was, is there a deeper aquifer? And there is, in parts of the Ogallala, all the way down into Texas, there is the Dakota aquifer that's below the Ogallala, and we have looked at the Dakota. And in fact, in Texas, they've looked at it. They're trying to use it, and we're trying to use it some for domestic use for city. It tends to be saltier. It's saline. Quality of the water is not as good. It's quite a bit more expensive to use, and we don't think there's going to be the capacity for irrigation out there. We have some crazy ideas. We just did a study, and we've studied it several times. There's been a push to build an aqueduct from the Missouri River and divert several million acre feet. We've just got done with a study on that. And that's still somewhere in the, that's the dream of some in western Kansas. And so far the cost is way too expensive to make it work. There's all kinds of problems with that one. Okay,
Okay.
thank you.